Joining us today on Breaking Points is Wally Rashid. He is a Palestinian-American entrepreneur and social media personality. He's spoken a lot about what his family has gone through and is still going through in the occupied West Bank.
I showed this a few weeks ago when they set fire to one of the cars in my family's village. This is my uncle recording this right now.
He's also been doing some very interesting coverage of the Israel-Palestine conflict, who has over 100,000 followers on TikTok.
Although the media has done a great job making people think that Arabs equal terrorists, the truth is the state of Israel was built on terrorism.
Wally, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. No, really excited to hear what your perspectives are, because I think it's really interesting. So I think the first place I'd like to start is kind of with the DNC, because that's what's been going on right now in history. A little bit poetic in terms of it being in Chicago. The last time I was there, 1968. We're seeing some similar themes, anti-war protests, potentially a little bit of a fracturing in the party as well between the more mainstream Democrats and the progressives. I wanted to kind of ask you, what's your reaction been to, first off, maybe the protests that have been happening at the DNC?
Yeah, definitely. So we knew going into the DNC it was going to be pretty tense. Security was going to be ramped up. I think that the protests were important to make a statement. I think it needed to be said, and I think that it was really important that especially the DNC and the Democratic Party understands how much the American people really want this. I think in that respect, it was important. I saw at the DNC at one point somebody unraveled a large flag that said "Stop Arms to Israel" or something similar, and it got taken down. I think that the Democratic Party in general, they already knew that the American people want a ceasefire. They've already been seeing all of the protests, so I feel like the pressure's already on them. And I honestly think it was good that it really kind of reiterated that.
So what do you think overall of the current platform as it relates to the Israel-Palestine conflict? Are you you've talked a little bit, I've heard you online in one of your videos talking about Kamala Harris and her policies on Israel-Palestine. So do you think between Trump and Kamala, who would you say is better in terms of outcome for the Palestinians? Kind of lay out your thought process.
Yeah, so this is it's interesting because it's controversial within my own community, within the Palestinian-American community, but it seems pretty straightforward to everybody outside of that community. And within the Palestinian-American community right now, I think the latest poll that I saw was 45% or so are voting third party for Jill. It's pretty alarming. I don't think I've seen a number that high for a third party candidate among a certain voting bloc. I think that if you look between Trump and Kamala, it's pretty clear, especially if you look out and lay out the policies, which I did recently. It's that a Democratic politician is just going to be better for Palestine, pro-Palestine policy, and they're going to consider the situation from a more equal perspective. But at the end of the day, both parties are very much so bought out by AIPAC and Kufi. So the United States is always going to be pro-Israel with the current landscape. I just think really it's about damage control, which is why I advocate a bit more for Kamala. And what people need to understand is it's really the political environment is so much different. Right now, if even if you just go back last year prior to October 7th, there has never been a pro-Palestinian lobbyist group. There was the American Muslim Association, I believe, that was advocating in some regard to Palestinian rights, but there has never been a focus on a Palestinian lobbyist group or NGOs, or really a lot focusing in the political sphere. So I think considering that, I've been advocating for Kamala, not because I think she herself is going to be able to make a huge shift in Palestine policy, but I think it allows the landscape for, pro-Palestinian lobbyist groups to begin to emerge, and they can use her presidency a lot better than they could use Trump's. It's going to be a lot easier for them to push forward pro-Palestine policy.
Interesting. I could see why that take is somewhat controversial within this more activist space in voices for Palestinian liberation. Can you lay out a little bit, because you said the policies for Kamala are going to be a little bit better. Are there any specifics that you're looking at that say, because you also said that, right, both parties are more or less bought out by AIPAC, both parties are going to be pro-Israel. So what specifically in terms of policy are you looking at that's going to be different between a Kamala presidency and a Trump presidency?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we look over the past 8 years, there were so many differences. The Golan Heights, the United States recognized the Golan Heights as part of Israel under Trump's presidency. The United States reversed the view that settlements are legitimate under Trump's presidency. Under Trump's presidency, he put visa restrictions on Palestinian officials. Under Trump's presidency, he closed PLO offices in Washington, D.C. Under Biden's presidency, and don't get me wrong, I want to make sure, especially the Arab American audience and everybody else understands I'm not pro Biden in any way. And I don't agree with a lot of the Democratic administration. But under Biden's presidency, he at least began to change the stance on the settlements again and reversed it to having the visa restrictions on Palestinian officials were lightened under Biden's presidency. He tried to make things a bit more equal when it came to international forums with Palestinians. So there were a lot of differences that at the end of the day, it's one of the lesser evils type of situations, especially now coming up in the upcoming elections. I think 2024 Trump is a lot more bought out by pro-Israel interests in comparison to 2016 Trump. Just a couple of days ago, I think 3 days ago, Miriam Adelson was had an event with Trump, and Miriam Adelson is the widow of Sheldon Adelson, who gave Trump $20 million back in 2018 to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Now Miriam Adelson is giving him $100 million, and a lot believe it's on the stipulation he annexes more land in the West Bank. So there are so many outside political forces at play that need to be considered that at the end of the day, I think a Democratic candidate's going to be a lot better, especially with Miriam Adelson backing up Trump with so much money.
I want to switch gears a little bit to talking about your family in the West Bank, which I've seen you speak out a lot about online. Some of the scenes of horrific violence against people, as well as the destruction of property. So, can you talk to us a little bit, what your family has experienced, both pre-October 7th and how October 7th, how if anything has changed since then as well?
Yeah, my family's in a small village called Bureen in the West Bank. It's about 20 minutes south of one of the major cities, Nablus. And my family's village, out of all the villages in the West Bank, the most hostile Israeli settlement in the West Bank is called Yitzhar, and they just so happen to be positioned right next to my family. The settlement started was born in 1982 or so, and it's been expanding. Still a small, relatively small settlement right now, between 2 to 3,000 settlers, but they are incredibly hostile. The settlement is on top of a mountaintop. Most Israeli settlements are on mountaintops, and Palestinian villages are in the valleys. They pushed us down into the valleys, and after October 7th, especially, they really ramped up violence. They've always been very violent. They've killed my family in the West Bank. They'll come down with their M16 rifles and they'll light houses on fire. They'll light cars on fire, and nobody is really there to stop them. So they really have a free pass. And a lot of the times, genuinely, they just see Palestinians as wild game. They really don't view us as human. That was prior to October 7th. This is after October 7th. And the reason they feel so comfortable treating Palestinians so horribly is because they have full impunity to do so. A lot of the times, the IDF and the settlers are one. A lot of the times, what you'll see is the settlers will toss their IDF uniform and then come down into the village. So, if a especially if a Palestinian boy or man leaves his house, they'll shoot him with impunity. Since October 7th, two of my close family friends have passed away. One of them was a 10-year-old boy. The other one was a 16-year-old, and they were just standing outside of their homes when the settlers came down. They really it's hard to separate the religious aspect from it, because so much of their motivation to act this way is because they really believe God gave them the land and that we're invaders in their land.
Some horrific scenes, I would have to imagine. So do you, I've heard some people talk about this in terms of Israeli culture. Do you think, and what people have been saying is that it's not really like what they're doing to Gaza is not really, it's a mainstream position, right? To do this kind of invasion or just carpet bombing kind of thing is not, there's not that much opposition to that going on in Israel, versus some of the rhetoric I hear is like, well, you got to separate the Israeli government from what people in Israel want. Does it seem like the people in Israel more or less support what's going on over there?
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, I think they've done some polls, and the majority of them believe that the IDF could be even more aggressive than they currently are. The latest poll that I saw. So what needs to be understood is that the government is isolating Israelis from the rest of the world. They banned Al Jazeera and called it a terrorist media site, media company. They're limiting on the speech that's being said. So they're hearing so much propaganda, and it's just festering within the country as a whole, that it's really shifted the entire region. I genuinely believe this is how the vast majority of them, the vast majority of them, support what's going on. The data supports this. What I will say is that there is a difference between very religious Israelis and the more secular ones. And I believe I heard that about 60% of Israel is secular. So the settlers that are attacking my family, for example, in the West Bank, they tend to be very low income individuals. The reason they're even living in the West Bank is because the Israeli government gives them tax write-offs to live in the West Bank. Most Israelis don't want to live in the West Bank, so you're really getting the worst of the worst that do come into the West Bank. And the same thing is with Gaza. Most Israelis that are secular don't want to settle Gaza. They might want settlement in Gaza to happen, but they definitely don't want to be the people living there. It tends to be more of the religious, very hardcore religious Jewish people living in Israel that believe that God gave them the land and there isn't hurt to do so, versus the rest of the secular ones. But even among the secular ones, they're still very, very hostile. So I think this notion that you can separate the Israeli government from the people to some degree, but at the end of the day, it's become a cultural mindset to view Palestinians as less than, to view Palestinians as all terrorists. It has to You have to reteach the society at this point.
I more or less kind of agree with your take there, and it's kind of spurned on, I think, this kind of reactionary thinking here. I think in the U.S., what I'm referring to kind of is the what I would call the new independent right, kind of the Candace Owens, since she's left Ben Shapiro, making quite the waves online in terms of she's combining what I'm seeing is combining mainstream criticism of Israel, which is basically the notion that it shouldn't be anti-Semitic to be against genocide, which I think we can all more or less agree with. But then
Absolutely.
also sprinkling in some, a few days ago, she was talking about the origins of the Anti-Defamation League,
Yeah.
insinuating there's a high prevalence of pedophilia amongst Jews, to also talking about Israel being founded by Frankists. I haven't really looked into what that really means, and enough to say whether it's true or false. So voices like hers, I'm wondering for you, is that a net positive or negative for Palestinian liberation?
Yeah, this is what I'll say is I definitely don't agree with a lot of Candace's rhetoric. However, I think it's very important to recognize that honestly historic in mainstream culture what she's doing, because she is a conservative voice. She's a very she's a conservative Republican voice, and she's really going outside of the Republican narrative. If you look at the latest polls, only 5% support Palestinians. I don't think Candace Owens is doing what she's doing because she's pro-Palestine. She might be, against genocide. I think the reason she's talking the way she is because she seems to be coming from an America first mindset. And what I can tell the difference is between the Palestinian movement and what Candace Owens is doing is Candace Owens is coming at it from I want America first and I don't like how much Israel is influencing America. And it's a lot more focused on that, while also not tolerating the inhumanity Israel's creating against the Palestinian people. So regardless, though, it's really nice, honestly, to see conservative Republicans starting to speak out. And it's not just her. I mean, I've even been seeing Tucker Carlson make some statements as well regarding he interviewed Thomas Massey, and his that interview regarding Thomas Massey's statements with APAC. That was unprecedented in the conservative right wing. We haven't seen that sort of rhetoric come out in the mainstream. So from that regard, I think what Candace Owens is doing is incredible because it's finally giving a voice to individuals that never had that voice in mainstream culture.
And that's, I mean, in my opinion, that's kind of how coalitions are built, right? You might not necessarily agree on everything, right? One's coming at it from maybe a liberation point of view. The other is coming from, hey, we need to be America first, and all these policies don't seem like they're being America first. And so some progress can be made on that front. And it's funny you bring up Tucker Carlson. I think when the interview, my reaction to the Thomas Massie interview is that he's doing it very carefully. Like Tucker Carlson is very, very skilled at what he does. And I lost count of the number of times he said he loves Israel in that particular
Yeah.
interview, because he almost has to say it to counteract some of the information that Massey is giving about APAC babysitters and things like that. And he was, oh, just so everybody knows, I love going to Israel. It's one of my favorite places in the world, and this and that. So I found that to be kind of interesting. But speaking of influence, before I let you go, I kind of want to touch on the TikTok ban, because you're such a big creator on TikTok. Just point blank, are we banning it because China is stealing our data and it's a national security issue, or does it really more have to do with more of that pro-Palestine, anti-Israel rhetoric that has proliferated on TikTok, at least for a period of time? What's your take there?
Genuinely, I really believe it's due to the pro-Palestinian rhetoric. Trump tried to ban it early on back in 2020, never went through. The past few years, it hasn't really came into the limelight. It was never considered as much of a national security threat as it is now, especially as it is now in the mainstream media. I think that it very much so hampers Israel's actions in the Middle East, because so many more people are speaking out and so many more people are mobilizing. From the stance of the United States, that's been a very tough that's been very tough to control. We've been seeing a lot of the college protests. It's become a nationwide phenomenon, and I can't imagine how the United States wouldn't be seeing the and have a lot of genuine, criticism towards Israel, and allow this sort of rhetoric to, come out of the limelight, especially considering how many politicians are supported by pro-Israel interests. If the majority of our politicians are supported by APAC or Kufi or other pro-Israel aligned group. So if we're seeing this much of a shift on TikTok, it's really not that hard for any of these pro-Israel organizations to draft up some sort of legislation, show it to their politicians, be like, hey, is this something you can present? I can't see how that's not happening behind the scenes. I feel like you have to be very ignorant to that to believe that that's not going on.
Yeah, can't disagree with that analysis right there. And we've seen some of the other apps also, because they have more influence among, we've seen Meta talk about how Zionism is, or the word Zionist is now kind of a slur on there, so you can't use it in that way. We've seen some of the influence, I think, even on X, which is, I would consider, more free speech, but we've seen some of the censorship that happens around this topic as well. And Elon showing some signs of trying to work with the pro-Israel voices. We saw him with the Netanyahu speech, also meeting with the ADL, these types of things. But anyways, I want to know, before we sign off here, what direction, is your advocacy headed? What kind of projects are you working on? Where can people follow you if they want to hear more of what you have to say?
Yeah, definitely appreciate it. Right now, what I'm mainly focused on is just talking about Israel Palestine, also just geopolitics in general. You can find me at Wally Rashid on social media, on Instagram and TikTok and X. And just focusing on, I started my nonprofit Olive Peace, focused on U.S. Palestine relations. You can also find that by clicking on my social media. Yeah, so that's where you can find me, and I appreciate giving me the time to speak with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. I think they're interesting. Gives us a little bit something to think about, which is what we're all about here at Breaking Point. So thank you so much for joining us today.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
If you're looking for more stories that the mainstream media is unwilling to tell, or hear from voices they're unwilling to talk to, please take a second to check out my YouTube channel, 5149 with James Lee. The link will be in the description below. As always, I'd like to thank you for your time, and of course, keep on tuning into Breaking Points.